In this video, I seek to prove God using Aristotle's metaphysics, and along the way, disprove polytheism, pantheism, materialism, and theistic personalism, and much more. Before I showcase the Aristotelian proof, I will give premises before the argument. Premise 1 is change is a real feature of the world. Premise 2 is but change is the actualization of a potential. Premise 3 is so the actualization of potential is a real feature of the world. Premise 4 is no potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. Premise 5 is so any change is caused by something already actual. Premise 6. The occurrence of any change C presupposes something or substance S which changes. Premise 7. The existence of S at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of S's potential for existence. Premise 8. So any substance S has at any moment some actualizer A of its own existence. Premise 9. A's own existence at the moment it actualizes S itself presupposes either A, the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, or B, A's being purely actual. Premise 10. If A's existence at the moment it actualizes S presupposes the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, then there exists a regress of concurrent actualizers that is either infinite or terminates in a purely actual actualizer. Premise 11. But such a regress of concurrent actualizers would constitute a hierarchical causal series, and such a series cannot regress infinitely. Premise 12. So, either A itself is a purely actual actualizer, or there is a purely actual actualizer which terminates the regress that begins with the actualization of A. Premise 13. So, the occurrence of C and thus the existence of S at any given moment presupposes the existence of a purely actual actualizer. Premise 14. So, there is a purely actual actualizer. So, we came to the conclusion of a purely actual actualizer based off those premises. Now, I will explain those premises, and after I explain those premises, I will showcase the premises for the divine attributes of the purely actual actualizer, such as unity and omnipotence, and then explain those premises. Now, you might be confused with some of the different words and concepts that were deployed in the premises. Don't worry, I will explain them. Now, the first metaphysical principles that should probably be introduced are actuality and potentiality. Now, actuality is something that is happening or is actually happening, and potentiality is something that could happen or has the potential to happen. Now, for a quick example, imagine somebody picks up an apple, and then imagine they place that apple on a table. Now, that apple had the potential to be on a table, but the person actualized that potentiality of the apple. Now, notice that the thing that actualized the apple to be on the table is that which is already actual. The girl, her motor neurons actualized her to actualize the potential for the apple to be on the table. So, that which is actualized by that which is already actual. Now, the next metaphysical principles that should probably be introduced are linear causality and hierarchical causality. Now, the first I'm going to introduce is linear causality. Now, linear causality is that cause that had taken an event previously in the past and has independent power regardless of the state of the previous causes, and could in theory extend backward into infinity. Now, to give a quick example, imagine a coffee cup on a table. And then imagine after the coffee cup sat on the table for a while, it became cold. The coffee is cold because the air in the room cooled it. But the air was cold because of the air conditioner, and the air conditioner went on because you pressed a certain button, and so forth. Now, this is what you would call a linear series of causes. But for sake of argument, let's suppose this series extends backward into infinity without a beginning and with no temporal first actualizer. Now, linear causality could in theory extend back to infinity without any first actualizer, but hierarchical causality cannot and must have a first actualizer. Consider again, the coffee cup sits on your desk. It is, we may suppose, 3 feet above the floor. Why? Because the desk is holding it up. But what holds the desk up? The floor, of course. Now, this is a hierarchical causal chain where the desk is being held up only insofar as it is held up by the floor in that moment. Now, the cup has no capacity on its own to be 3 feet from the ground. It will be there only insofar as something such as the desk is there for it to derive power from it to hold it up. But the desk in turn will too require something to derive its power, namely the floor, and so forth. The members of this chain have no power to hold up the cup on its own, but they only hold the cup up insofar as they derive the power to do so. Therefore, in a hierarchical causal chain, there has to be a first member or actualizer to actualize or derive the power for the causal chain. Or to sum everything up, hierarchical causality depends at all moments on previous causes for its causal power and must have a first actualizer to derive its causal power. Now, the hierarchical causality is what concerns us here, for it is more fundamental to reality than the other linear sort of series is. Now, let's go back to the coffee in the cup. To state the obvious, it can only get cold or be held up by the desk if it is in existence. Non existent coffee cannot do either or anything else. Now, what makes it the case that the coffee exists? Obviously, someone made it by pouring hot water through the coffee grounds, but that's not what I'm asking about. I mean, what makes it true that the coffee is in existence here and now, and at any particular moment that it is in existence? What keeps it in existence? What we have, as you may have noticed, is something like the cup, which is held up by the desk, which is in turn held up by the floor. Only in this case, it is the very existence of a thing that is at issue rather than merely its particular location. The potential of the coffee to exist here and now is actualized, which is in part by the existence of the water, which in turn exists only because a certain potential of the atoms is being actualized, where these atoms themselves exist only because a certain potential of the subatomic particles is being actualized. Now, this is a hierarchical series, one which, as we have seen, must have a first member. Now, this first member can impart causal power to the other members of the series without having to have that power imparted to it, something that has its causal power in a built in or non derivative way. Now, since what is being explained in this case is the actualization of a thing's potential for existence, the sort of first cause we are talking about is one which can actualize the potential for other things to exist without having to have its own existence actualized by anything. What this entails is that this cause doesn't have potential for existence that needs to be actualized in the first place. It just is actual, always and already actual. Or, in other words, this first member is pure actuality. It doesn't merely happen not to have a cause of its own, but could not in principle have had or needed one. For being devoid of potentiality, there is nothing in it that could have needed any actualizing the way other things do. It is in this sense that it is an uncaused cause, or to use Aristotle's famous expression, an unmoved mover. Or to be more precise, we might call it an unactualized actualizer. Now, notice that we reach this result by beginning with ordinary individual objects and processes, such as a coffee cup and the cooling down of the coffee within it. We didn't start by asking where the universe as a whole came from, and we need not start with any claim about the universe as a whole in order to get an unactualized actualizer. But what we have said has implications for the universe as a whole. For what is true of the water in the coffee is true of every other thing. The leaf that fell from the tree, the fly you swatted, and so on and so on. Everything is such that it can exist at any moment only if certain potentials are actualized. Hence, it is ultimately such that, like the water in the coffee, it can exist only at any moment as it is caused to exist by the unactualized actualizer. Now, I should strongly emphasize that the eternality of the universe is strongly irrelevant to the argument just made. In fact, Aristotle himself believed the universe was eternal, but knew that the very existence of the eternal universe presupposes a purely actual actualizer, or God. Now, you might be asking, why might we call the purely actual actualizer God? For one thing, the purely actual actualizer or unmoved mover is the ultimate cause of all things. It is the intimate sense of being, that which keeps all things in existence at any moment at which they exist. But even more can be said, such as attributing the classical divine attributes to this purely actual actualizer. I will now show the premises for the second stage of the argument as identifying this purely actual actualizer as God by identifying the classical divine attributes to this purely actual actualizer. Premise 1. In order for there to be more than one purely actual actualizer, there would have to be some differentiating feature that one such actualizer has that the others lack. Premise 2. But there could be such a differentiating feature only if a purely actual actualizer had some unactualized potential, which, being purely actual, it does not have. Premise 3. So, there can be no such differentiating feature, and thus no way for there to be more than one purely actual actualizer. Premise 4. So, there is only one purely actual actualizer. Premise 5. In order for this purely actual actualizer to be capable of change, it would have to have potentials capable of actualization. Premise 6. But, being purely actual, it lacks any such potentials. Premise 7. So, it is immutable or incapable of change. Premise 8. If this purely actual actualizer existed in time, then it would be capable of change, which it is not. Premise 9. So, this purely actual actualizer is eternal, existing outside of time. Premise 10. If the purely actual actualizer were material, then it would be changeable and exist in time, which it is not. Premise 11. So, the purely actual actualizer is immaterial. Premise 12. If the purely actual actualizer were corporal, then it would be material, which it is not. Premise 13. So, the purely actual actualizer is incorporeal. Premise 14. If the purely actual actualizer were imperfect in any way, it would have some unactualized potential, which, being purely actual, it does not have. Premise 15. So, the purely actual actualizer is perfect. Premise 16. For something to be less than fully good is for to have a privation, that is, to fail to actualize some feature proper to it. A purely actual actualizer, being purely actual, can have no such privation. Premise 17. So, the purely actual actualizer is fully good. Premise 18. To have power entails being able to actualize potentials. Premise 19. Any potential that is actualized by the purely actual actualizer or by a series of actualizers which terminates in the purely actual actualizer. Premise 20. So, all power derives from the purely actual actualizer. Premise 21. But to be that from which all power derives is to be omnipotent. Premise 22. So, the purely actual actualizer is omnipotent. Premise 23. So, there exists a purely actual cause of the existence of things, which is one, immutable, eternal, immaterial, incorporeal, perfect, fully good, and omnipotent. Premise 24. But, for there to be such a cause of things is just what it is for God to exist. Premise 25. Therefore, God exists. Now, from those premises, we came to the conclusion that the purely actual actualizer is God. Now, I'm going to further explain each part of the premises. The first thing I'm going to further explain is God's unity, or monotheism. Now, the reason why there can't be more than one purely actual actualizer or God, even in principle, is because for there to be one or more or two of a thing, there would have to be something to differentiate them, something that one instance has that the others lack. And there can be no such differentiating feature where something purely actual is concerned. Thus, we typically distinguish the things of our experience by their material or temporal features, by one thing being larger or smaller than another, say, or taller or shorter than another, or existing at a time before or after another. But since what is purely actual is immaterial and eternal, one purely actual thing could not be differentiated from another in terms of such features. Or more generally, two or more of the things of a kind are to be differentiated in terms of some perfection or privation that one has and the other lacks. We might say, for instance, that this tree's roots are more sturdy than the one's, or that this squirrel is lacking its tail while the other has its tail. But as we have seen, what is purely actual is completely devoid of any privation or potentiality, and hence can be no way in principle to differentiate one purely actual cause from another in terms of their respective perfections and privations. But then such a cause possesses the attribute of unity. That is to say, there cannot be, even in principle, more than one purely actual cause. Hence, it is the same one purely actual actualizer to which all things owe their existence. Now, what about immutability? Well, since the cause of things is pure actuality, and therefore devoid of potentiality, it cannot go from potentiality to actuality, and is thus immutable or unchangeable. And since existing within time entails changeability, an immutable cause must also be eternal in the sense of existing outside of time altogether. And since being material entails being changeable and existing within time, an immutable and eternal cause must be immaterial and thus incorporeal or without any sort of body. Consider now what it is for a thing to be imperfect or flawed. An injured animal or damaged plant is imperfect insofar as it is no longer capable of realizing the ends its nature has set for it. For instance, a squirrel which has been hit by a car may be unable to run away from predators as swiftly as it needs to, and a tree whose roots have been damaged may be unstable or unable to take in all the water and nutrients it needs in order to remain healthy. A defect of this sort is, to use some philosophical jargon, a privation, the absence of some feature a thing would naturally require so as to be complete. It involves the failure to realize some potential inherent in a thing. Something is perfect then to the extent that it has actualized such potentials and is without privations, but then a purely actual cause of things, precisely since it is purely actual and thus devoid of unactualized or unrealized potentiality or privation, possesses maximal perfection. Consider further that a thing is good, in a general sense, to the extent that it has realized the potentials inherent in it as the kind of thing it is, and bad to the extent that it fails to realize them. A good painter, for example, is good to the extent that he has realized his potential for mastery of the various aspects of painting, craftsmanship, composition, and so forth, while a bad painter is bad to the extent that he has failed to acquire the relevant skills. But a purely actual cause of the world, devoid as it is of potentiality, cannot be said to be bad or deficient in any way, but on the contrary, as we have seen, to be perfect. In that sense, such a cause must be fully good. Consider now that to have power is just to be able to make something happen, to actualize some potential. But then, since the cause of the existence of all things is pure actuality itself, rather than merely one actual thing among others, and it is the source of all the actualizing power anything else has, it has all possible power and is omnipotent. But, like was said in the premises, if there exists a purely actual cause of the existence of things, which is one, immutable, eternal, immaterial, incorporeal, perfect, fully good, and omnipotent, then that is just what it is for God to exist. Therefore, Aristotle's argument for the existence of God is successful, and any other worldview, like atheism, polytheism, or pantheism or materialism that deviates from this purely actual cause, is false.